Hi, and welcome back to another lecture. This is topic 2.3, the regions of the British colonies, and the main theme that we're focusing on today is geography and the environment. Really, how the environment of the British colonies led to a unique character for each of the regions. The learning objective is to explain how and why environmental and other factors shaped the development and expansion of various British colonies that developed and expanded from 1607 to 1754. Clearly, the theme shows up here for geography and the environment. The first key concept is the Chesapeake and the southern colonies grew prosperous exporting tobacco, a labor-intensive product initially cultivated by whites, mostly male indentured servants, and later by enslaved Africans. This is seen in the original settlement of Jamestown. It's formally established in 1607 by the Virginia Joint Stock Company. At first, the settlers had gone out thinking that they would find gold, silver, and other types of mineral wealth. They forewent planting food and other necessities for their survival, which is why many of the early Jamestown settlers perished. John Smith had been designated as a leader for the new colony and gets colonists in line to plant food. After the First Anglo-Powhatan War, Lord Delaware is sent to the colony by England and becomes its governor. He rules more strictly, making sure that the colony can survive. John Rolfe was a Jamestown colonist who developed a new strand of tobacco that made it easier to grow in Virginia. Therefore, it becomes more profitable. As tobacco becomes a lucrative crop, the colonists in Jamestown want to expand further. Expand into more land to plant, and that's where they get into conflicts with the Powhatan once again. That's the Native American tribe that's near Virginia. Maryland was also a plantation colony. They grew tobacco. It was at first granted to Lord Baltimore by King Charles I in 1632. So it was a proprietary colony. It was set up with the intention of being a Catholic haven. We saw the Acts of Toleration were passed by the Maryland legislature to protect all Christian sects. However, it did not protect Jewish settlers, and in fact, it gave the death penalty for anyone who denied the divinity of Jesus. As for the Carolinas, Charles II issued the charter for the colony to use as a way to reward his supporters with land grants. In the middle of the 17th century, England underwent a civil war that momentarily toppled the monarchy. Charles II was the first monarch restored after the war, so he had to thank the people that had put him in power in some way. Charleston, in what is now South Carolina, was settled first, and due to the nature of the land grants, it had an aristocratic climate. Many of the first settlers were also wealthy plantation owners from Barbados that had experienced implementing a slave plantation system. Rice is the main crop that was grown, but they also had considerable plantations for the cash crops like indigo. Since the official settlement of the Carolina colony was slow and limited to what is now South Carolina, discontent and landless farmers began going into what is now North Carolina and squatting. Squatting is taking up a piece of land without having official rights to it. These squatters weren't sanctioned by the colonial governments, and they definitely weren't sanctioned by the native populations that occupied that territory. Therefore, it led to greater conflict with natives in the form of the Tuscarora War and the Yamasee War. The second part of the learning objective dealt with labor systems that were present in the Chesapeake colonies. There were indentured servants that came through the headright system. A picture of what an indentured contract looked like is shown on the screen. Just a standard piece of paper where people would sell themselves into servitude for 5 to 7 years. In exchange, they would have their passage across the Atlantic paid for. After their 5 years of service, they would be released from the contract, and sometimes they would be given a land grant, either from the plantation owner or from whoever held the charter to the colony. The headright system benefited the plantation owners because for every indentured contract that they received, they would be given more land within the colony. Indentures would be white males and females from England. The reason why they would take on these contracts is because the economic opportunities in England were not very good. As land became scarce in England and more indentured servants go to the Chesapeake colonies, land in the Chesapeake colonies in turn becomes more scarce, or rather land that doesn't belong to or is used by Native Americans becomes more scarce. Discontent amongst the western frontier Virginia farmers begins to grow, and they want the Virginia colony to expand its borders into native territory. But the Virginia governor, William Berkeley, is hesitant to do so to try and keep the peace with the Native Americans. Nathaniel Bacon, a Virginia farmer that particularly disliked Governor Berkeley, gets all the discontent farmers from the western frontier of Virginia and carries out a massacre of native tribes in western Virginia. Then they march over to Jamestown to burn down the settlements to show their discontent for the land policy of the colony. Since indentured servants became so disaffected after their contract ended, and it could lead to another rebellion, plantation owners then turned to another source of labor that would not produce such an unhappy population. That's why they turned to African slave trade. It becomes cheaper to buy enslaved labor after the Royal African Company loses its monopoly on the transportation of enslaved people in 1689. Those two events had happened relatively close to each other, 1676 for Bacon's Rebellion and 1689 for the Royal African Company losing its monopoly, really helped lead to the increase of enslaved labor in the British colonies. The next learning objective takes us to the New England Colonies. The New England Colonies, initially settled by Puritans, developed around small towns with family farms and achieved a thriving mixed economy of agriculture and commerce. The first colony that was established was the Plymouth Colony, and it was established by separatists that sailed on the Mayflower. The Mayflower was the name of the ship, and they were called separatists because they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. They believed that the Anglican Church still shared many characteristics with the Catholic Church from which it split. They did not want to be part of it, and because separatists really didn't like the Catholic Church and disagreed with the Anglican Church in England, it was the equivalent of disagreeing with the king. They could not safely remain in England, so they came to North America by way of the Netherlands. Puritans had similar disagreements with the Anglican Church, but they don't necessarily want to separate themselves completely. They just want to purify the Anglican Church. They also sailed to North America, and they landed in Massachusetts Bay in 1629. John Winthrop was the governor of the settlement of the town of Boston at the time in 1630, leading the Puritans. Previous to the English Civil War, religious persecution in England fueled that migration into North America. The New England towns that they settled centered around their congregation, and religious dissent within that congregational church was not always welcome. Anyone that disagreed with the congregational church would be banished from the colony. There were two examples of this. Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson both ended up creating new settlements in what would later become Rhode Island and Connecticut. Therefore, religion was very important to the original separatist and Puritan colonists. New Hampshire and Connecticut are later cut out and awarded from the territory of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This was a way to exert greater royal control over New England. The crown wanted to make sure that they didn't have too much control over their own affairs and that they still remembered who was boss. The next learning objective covers the Middle Colonies. The Middle Colonies supported a flourishing export economy based on cereal crops and attracted a broad range of European migrants, leading to societies with greater cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity and tolerance. The Middle Colonies consisted of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York. New York used to be called New Amsterdam because it had been settled by the Dutch, and in 1664 it was taken over by the Duke of York, giving it its new name, New York. The Dutch that lived in the New York area were allowed to stay, continued to speak their own language, continued to practice their own religion, and then New Jersey was parceled out, taken from the rest of New York. It was settled by many Quakers, giving them the promise that they were going to be able to continue to practice their religion. William Penn will later get a grant or land that becomes Pennsylvania. He establishes Pennsylvania as a Quaker haven, so anyone that is Quaker can go there free of religious discrimination. Because the Quakers were also very tolerant of other religions, it created a very diverse population of settlers that are coming from all over Europe. Penn attempts to have friendly relations with the natives. When he arrives in Pennsylvania, despite already having been granted that land by the king, he trades with Native Americans in that area so that they can settle there without any problems. He advertises across Europe for settlers. He gives very generous land grants to the people who are willing to move to Pennsylvania, and because of this, there are going to be people that move to Pennsylvania that don't share the same pacifist Quaker views and philosophies on how natives and white settlers should interact. So they're going to end up having some contentious interactions later on in the 1700s. Next, we'll cover the economies and the labor structures of the British colonies. Indentured servants and then enslaved African labor is included in this learning objective. The colonies of the southern Atlantic coast and the British West Indies used long growing seasons to develop plantation economies based on exporting staple crops. They depended on the labor of enslaved Africans who often constituted the majority of the population in these areas and developed their own forms of cultural and religious autonomy. Let's start with enslaved labor in the British colonies. It begins in 1619. It's the first importation of enslaved people in Virginia. By 1770, enslaved labor is so common that Virginia will have 187,000 enslaved people, the most out of any colony. While Georgia and South Carolina's population is going to be comprised of mostly enslaved people, outnumbering the white population. As a result of becoming the demographic minority, the white population passed laws with the intent to maintain control of the enslaved population. Those southern colonies adopt laws from Caribbean islands where the plantation system was established before. A primary inspiration for the new colonial slave codes are the Barbados slave codes. Barbados is an island in the Caribbean that had established enslaved labor for their sugar plantations and had put these laws in place to try and control the behaviors of the enslaved people. By 1695, South Carolina adopted a form of slave codes that set a model for other southern colonies to follow. The basis of the slave codes is that it is acceptable for one to enslave another person based on their race, and those that are enslaved have restricted freedoms or recourses for their position. They won't be allowed to learn how to read and write, they're not going to be allowed to possess any weapons, and their movements across the colonies and across towns have to be monitored. Slave codes guarantee the return of an enslaved person in the event that they run away, and they will add more and more of these codes to the rest of the British colonial history. Despite these attempts at controlling the enslaved population, there were some things that enslaved population began to do to try and maintain their autonomy. Song and dance being continued to be practiced from the song and dances that they knew in West Africa, and the influences of those songs and dances can be seen in today's Afro-Caribbean music. Another way in which they tried to maintain autonomy was through the development of a new language, Gullah. It's a mixture of English and various West African languages. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Caribbean and then later to North America, they would be taken from all the different regions of West Africa. They were not always able to communicate and have the same language, so Gullah allowed them to share information and continue traditions by giving them a common language. Here's a closer detail of a map showing the slave populations across the original 13 colonies. The darker colors show colonies that had a greater population of enslaved people within their boundaries, and then obviously the numbers refer to the total numbers of enslaved people within those colonies. While Virginia had the most enslaved people within its borders at over 187,000, in South Carolina and Georgia, those populations made up a majority of the population. On the right side is a runaway slave ad that was taken out by Thomas Jefferson on a local Virginia newspaper. This is to show that the 1705 Virginia Slave Code allowed for the apprehension and return of runaway enslaved people. One of the most common ways in which enslaved people resisted their enslavement was by simply running away. And because of that, slave codes across the different colonies tried to guarantee their return upon capture. Plantation owners throughout the South would put these ads in newspapers and often offer rewards for their return. The final key concept is, distance in Britain's initially lax attention led to the colonies creating self-governing institutions that were unusually democratic for the era. The New England colonies based power in participatory town meetings, which in turn elected members to their colonial legislatures. In the southern colonies, elite planters exercised local authority and also dominated the elected assemblies. The cause for all of this lax attention between 1642 and 1651 was the English Civil War. Charles I, the King of England, was beheaded in 1649 during the Civil War period, and then England undergoes a period in which they're ruled by Oliver Cromwell, who uses dictatorial powers. In 1660, the crown is restored with Charles II, but then the Stuart dynasty, which Charles II is a part of, doesn't last more than one descendant after Charles II. James II was Charles II's son, is replaced in 1689 when Parliament asks William of Orange to come and be the King of England. In the 1700s, the British monarchy is transferred once again to the Hanover monarchs from the region which is Germany today. George I, George II, and later George III are in power through most of the 18th century. George I had less of an interest in the British Empire's affair, so much so that he barely spoke English. So there's a lot of turmoil, a lot of inconsistency in the British government during this time, which allows the colonies to have the freedom to look after their own affairs without England micromanaging their actions. Self-government looked different across the different regions. In New England, town meetings were held at the same place at which they would worship, and they would allow all those who were part of the congregation of the church to have a say in the matters of government. All males who were part of the congregation could vote. The Mayflower Compact that was written by the separatists who were sailing on the Mayflower had established an early form of self-government in Plymouth. Plymouth gets absorbed by the larger Massachusetts Bay Colony because over time religious fervor was not as strong as it was amongst the people who first settled the colony. As fewer and fewer people were full members of the congregation, changes were made so that the congregation could have more people. The halfway covenant was created so more people could have a say in the town's matters. It meant that even if one was not a full member of the congregation, one could still technically be able to take part in town meeting matters. The colony of Connecticut is where we have the first ever written constitution in North America. They wrote the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut in 1639. In the southern plantation colonies, there were elected legislatures. The Virginia House of Burgesses is the first example, and that was dominated by elite planters, like it says in the key concept. But it was an elected body nonetheless that was representative of the people who voted. Those who were allowed to vote were only white free males that owned property. Because it was so much easier to attain property in North America, that meant that a higher proportion of these white free males were able to vote than they would be in Europe. However, these democratic governments still left out women, landless men, and enslaved Africans. While there might have been a greater degree of democracy in the colonies, it's still by no means close to being as democratic as we are today. And finally, for the recap. Tobacco in the Chesapeake and North Carolina colonies was important. The work was first done by indentured servants and then later by enslaved Africans. The New England colonies settled in towns and small farms. The middle colonies focused on cereal crops and they were the most diverse in terms of demographics. The southern colonies exported staple crops and they depended on enslaved African labor to grow those crops. Enslaved Africans began to grow as a share of the southern population, and then there were several things that they did try to maintain their autonomy despite being enslaved. And finally, the benign neglect from England will lead to various forms of self-government, and as the colonies become more attached to those forms of self-government, they're going to react more aggressively in the event that England tries to take them away. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you are looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.